All we've got are pieces. We can't seem to figure out what the puzzle is supposed to look like. John Mitchell.
This is the famous parking garage scene from All the President's Men, where Robert Redford is meeting his source, Deep Throat.
Forget the myths that the media's created about the White House. Follow the money.
What do you mean? Where?
Oh, I can't tell you that.
Redford plays real-life Washington Post reporter Bob Woodward. Woodward, along with his colleague Carl Bernstein, are on the cusp of bringing down U.S. President Richard Nixon's White House during the Watergate scandal. He just needs to connect the dots.
You tell me what you know, and I'll confirm. I'll keep you in the right direction if I can, but that's all. Just follow the money.
Follow the money may have been a Hollywood catchphrase, but what Deep Throat was urging was to dig deeper. Look into campaign finances. There had to be a paper trail. A way to finish the puzzle.
Well, when Watergate was breaking, I was still, let's say, pretty angry about the course of American foreign policy and the like. And I was invited by a guy who had been in the CIA for 14 years to help him write his book, which I did.
John Marks was a young diplomat around the time of Watergate. He'd worked for the Foreign Service in Vietnam and then for an anti-war senator before writing his first book on the CIA.
The CIA and the Cults of Intelligence. And that preceded the book I wrote called The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, which you mostly want to talk about.
It was John Marks' second book on the CIA that set him on the course of sleuthing like Woodward and Bernstein. He even had his own codenamed source.
Let me just say, I had a CIA guy, a retired CIA guy, who I called Deep Trance.
Deep Trance?
Deep Trance, right? You know, there's Deep Throat and everything, and we're coming off Watergate. So I had Deep Trance. And Deep Trance would give me information, and he'd been part of the unit that did this kind of work.
John Marks followed his source, and he followed the money. And eventually it led him to Montreal, a psychiatrist named Dr. Ewan Cameron, and a massive CIA covert program known as MKUltra. I'm Michelle Shepard, and this is Brainwashed. Episode 3, Exposing MKUltra.
Congressional leaders in the United States are calling for a full-scale public inquiry into the disclosures made in the New York Times that the CIA was involved in domestic spying. In Washington, we have the man who broke the story, Seymour Hersh.
I quoted somebody in my Sunday story saying it was like he stepped into a cesspool, one bomb after another, one hand grenade after another. He discovered the Watergate mess, and then he also discovered this domestic operation.
Here's a rarely told truth about investigative journalism. It can be pretty tedious. It's not all sources with code names and meetings and dimly lit parking garages. A lot of it is just about pouring through documents, essentially being a bureaucrat. Or rather, maybe smarter than a bureaucrat and their overlords who might be trying to hide something. Investigative journalism was in its heyday when John Marks began his career. After Woodward and Bernstein brought down Nixon, the New York Times' Seymour Hersh exposed another scandal: allegations of domestic spying by the CIA.
The CIA had been committing crimes inside the United States since the 50s. Wiretapping, illegal mail cover, surveillance of mail, that is, break-ins against Soviet agents and Americans they believed to be involved with Soviet agents. The CIA began collecting dossiers on American citizens.
Hersh also found that the agency was illegally spying on anti-war protesters and other dissidents, including members of the Black Panthers. President Gerald Ford opposed any kind of investigation, but the political climate in the U.S. had shifted. Americans demanded a more transparent government. So Ford appointed his VP, Nelson Rockefeller, to report back on the CIA's activities inside the United States.
And When the Rockefeller Commission report came out, it was generally thought to be something of a cover-up, but there was a lot of interesting stuff in it at the same time.
The most salacious detail, and the one that the media pounced on, was that the CIA had been experimenting with the hallucinogenic drug LSD, and that a CIA biochemist named Frank Olson had LSD slipped in his drink by colleagues and had died a few days later. He fell, or he jumped, or he was pushed to his death from a 13th floor hotel window in New York City.
And then it said this incident was part of a much larger program to find ways to control human behavior by using the behavioral sciences.
This is what intrigued John Marks. What was this larger program to control human behavior?
Almost the next day, I filed a Freedom of Information request, and the CIA came back to me and said, sorry, but we didn't give the Rockefeller Commission any written material about that particular section. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So I gave that particular information to the Washington Post, which had a little blurb saying the CIA didn't give any material backing up its story on the behavioral science program. And within days, I believe, or weeks, I was contacted by the CIA to say, in fact, they had found 13 boxes of material. And so I was in business.
But here comes that boring part of journalism. He wasn't really in business, not right away. It took several years and the help of lawyers associated with the American Civil Liberties Union to get the documents.
And that was something. But without the researchers, I couldn't have done it because it was just such a long, massive research.
John Marks was on to something. Something big. Something the CIA codenamed MKUltra. But as he sifted through the massive intelligence file, the CIA was working hard to control the narrative. Yes, they had a covert program, they admitted. But it was simply an opportunity to test the power of LSD. Nothing more. Marks knew it was so much more.
And so, when in doubt, escalate tends to be my motto.
He held a press conference and released just a small sample of the documents he had acquired. This is from CBS News.
The released CIA documents deal with a project codenamed MKUltra in operation between 1953 and 1964. It involved drug experiments to control human behavior. These documents turned over to CIA critic John Marks under the Freedom of Information Act.
The documents are so heavily deleted at times they look like Swiss cheese. They do not want us to know where it went on, who it was done with, and who did it. This is a program for manipulating people's minds, which to me is a lot stronger and heavier than a program of drug experimentation.
I wound up on the front page the next day of the Washington Post, the New York Times, and all three network news. And at that point, I got a call from a publisher from the New York Times Books, and they said, we'd like to give you an advance to write a book. And I am not sure up to that point I had even decided I was going to write a book, but that seemed kind of interesting to me. And they loved the title, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. That's what sold it.
Where did you come up with that for the book?
Well, the Manchurian Candidate was a famous movie and book starring Frank Sinatra, Lawrence Harvey, and I think Angela Lansbury. And it was about a controlled assassin who had been brainwashed supposedly by the North Koreans and the Chinese and was going to assassinate the President of the United States. And
well, we are at war. It's a cold war. But it will get worse and worse until every man, woman, and child in this country will have to stand up and be counted.
The whole idea of having a controlled assassin, having been brainwashed, was one of the things that the CIA was looking for. So The Search for the Manchurian Candidate was a logical title to me.
I'm just going to stop here for a second before we get into the specific details of what the CIA was doing. Just what exactly happened in the MKUltra program. A lot of you may want to dismiss this as conspiracy theories. I've had those doubts too. And I've been reporting on the dark and sometimes surreal world of espionage for years. I once even interviewed 2 former CIA heads aboard a spy cruise. Yep, it's a thing. Or it used to be anyway. They defended the use of waterboarding over cocktails. So let's just say this isn't my first rodeo. But until I started working on this podcast, I didn't fully know the CIA's history. That they hired Nazi doctors and drugged prisoners, trying out hundreds of types of drugs. The CIA used electroshocks, hypnosis, severe harassment. So when I hear someone say,
"That was a national security bordello in which we hired prostitutes to give LSD to their clients in order to help the United States fight communism,"
I'm like, what?
Operation Midnight Climax, as it was called.
It wasn't.
Absolutely.
These are the kind of stories that just inherently sound like conspiracy theories. People hear it and they don't believe it.
I've written a lot of books about stories that people don't understand or believe or know about. But this one is really beyond even what I'd ever come up with before. How could this have happened? Wait a minute. Let me find another document. Let me find something else that proves this. Can this really be true? Yeah, it was.
So, here we go.
I'm Stephen Kinzer. I'm a former New York Times foreign correspondent. I write a world affairs column for the Boston Globe. And I'm the author of Poisoner-in-Chief, Sidney Gottlieb, and the CIA Search for Mind Control.
Sidney Gottlieb was the CIA's senior chemist. He was one of the agency's pioneers. The CIA was formed in 1947 after the Second World War and at the start of the Cold War. It was an uncertain, fearful, paranoid time. And during the Korean War, strange things started happening with American prisoners of war. Some began collaborating with their captors. Several pilots confessed to having used biological weapons, something the U.S. firmly denied. And later, 21 POWs refused to repatriate to America. There had to be an explanation.
So the fear that gripped the CIA was that Soviet Union or Communist China had found the key to mind control. Then we realized that if you could do this, if you could find a way to control people's minds, essentially the prize would be nothing less than global mastery. So not only were we terrified that communists had found the secret, but we determined to go out and find it for ourselves. The first question they asked is, what research is already out there? Who's already looked into the problems that we're trying to investigate? Essentially, how to destroy human beings. And they thought, well, let's look at the Nazis. And sure enough, they found that there were Nazi doctors and scientists who had a lot of information that they gathered from experiments in which they killed people. And while we pretended that we were so horrified at what the Nazis were doing, we wound up hiring some of the people that conducted some of the most horrific Nazi experiments in concentration camps, as well as those who had conducted experiments that in some ways were even more gruesome in the Imperial Japanese military. As the Second World War came to an end, many Nazis were rounded up by the American Intelligence Service, and those who had a scientific background were thought of as especially valuable. Those files were put in a separate pile with paperclips on them. And
the CIA gave this program the codename Operation Paperclip.
That was the operation by which Nazis were brought to the United States to work first as intelligence agents for the United States, second as rocket scientists, and third, finally, as scientists and biochemists working for the CIA mind control project. So the CIA began several projects aimed at carrying out experiments with various drugs, sensory deprivation, electroshock, and other techniques.
Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA's chemist, was obsessed with the mission to control minds. He wanted all the research rolled into one program, which he would direct. MKUltra.
Sidney Gottlieb is an amazing character. He lived in total anonymity. Nobody ever heard of him. Nobody knew who he was. In a sense, my book is the biography of a person who didn't exist as far as anybody knew. But boy, what a life he led in secret.
There weren't any whistleblowers at the time. No one questioned what Sidney Gottlieb was directing. Only one man seemed to have some doubts.
Frank Olson was expressing his regrets, his fears, his desire to quit to various people. He even told it to his superiors at the CIA, I'm finished, I want to quit. They persuaded him to stay on. One thing led to another. They wanted to give him psychological treatment. At one time, he was invited to a retreat by Gottlieb and other members of the inner core of MKUltra. They went to this retreat, and on the first night, several of the people, including Frank Olson, were fed drinks that had LSD in them. We're not quite sure what the point of all that was. A few days later in New York, Olson went out the window. It was reported as the suicide of an Army scientist. So he was not an Army scientist. He was actually a CIA scientist. And whether it was suicide was uncertain, but it certainly was reported that way.
MKUltra, the CIA's program to harness the power of brainwashing, became a massive operation. Scientists would work for the CIA at secret sites throughout the US, Europe, and Asia.
Abroad, these experiments were even more intense. Gottlieb had established a series of operations where he could requisition human subjects, expendables, prisoners, people that the military intelligence agents in those countries would supply to him. He would then use them to see what various combinations of drugs would do to a human mind and body.
149 subprojects, 80 institutions, including 44 universities, 12 hospitals, 3 penitentiaries, 185 researchers. LSD did play a starring role in many of the experiments, but it was not just about how the drug affected the brain, as the CIA would later claim, but an attempt to use the drug to brainwash.
Gottlieb came to believe that this could be, as one of his associates put it, the secret that could unlock the universe. In other words, this could be the key to mind control. This would be a way you could destroy a human being's mind. In 1953, Gottlieb persuaded the CIA to buy the entire world supply of LSD. It was all being produced by one laboratory in Switzerland, and it all came to the United States. So he would feed huge doses of LSD to prisoners, among others, and try to see what their reaction would be, to see if this is a way you can destroy a human mind. One of the most bizarre experiments that Sidney Gottlieb came up with had to do with testing LSD and sex. Could we find a combination that would lead people to speak or would somehow open their minds to control?
Yes, this is Operation Midnight Climax.
So in order to test this, he opened up a bordello in San Francisco. The people working for him hired a group of prostitutes, and their job was to bring their clients back to this apartment on Telegraph Hill with a nice view over the San Francisco Bay. There, the men would be given drinks that were laced with LSD, and the federal narcotics agent who was supervising this operation for Gottlieb would watch the proceedings from behind a one-way mirror while sitting on his portable toilet and drinking martinis from a pitcher. This guy had no training in psychology, biology, or anything like that, so it was a highly unscientific experiment, to put it mildly.
Not all MKUltra experiments involved unwitting subjects. Some people volunteered, although they had no idea the CIA was behind the testing.
The CIA, through a bogus medical foundation, sent out notices to a whole array of hospitals and universities and clinics across the United States, saying essentially, we've discovered this new substance, LSD. It's a psychoactive drug. We want to test it. We're going to send you the LSD. You will then advertise for volunteers who you can pay. So who were some of the early subjects? Who were some of the first volunteers? Well, one of them was the novelist Ken Kesey, who went on to write that counterculture Bible, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Ken Kesey, the hero of Tom Wolfe's The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. The New York Times, upon Kesey's death, called him the Pied Piper of the psychedelic era.
Ken Kesey tried LSD in an experiment, and he loved it so much that he got a job in the hospital, the Menlo Park Veterans Administration Hospital in California. That's where he gathered the material for writing that book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But as he later said, that was just something that came later. The real reason he wanted to get the job was so that he could steal the LSD from the laboratories and bring it home and share it with all his friends. Another one of the early volunteers was the poet Allen Ginsberg.
I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked.
Another one was Robert Hunter, the lyricist for the Grateful Dead. He loved LSD too and took it home and turned on the other Grateful Dead members.
What a long, strange trip it's been.
So actually, none of these people understood at the time that their LSD was coming from the CIA. They, however, were the ones through whom LSD leaked out of the laboratory into the counterculture. The irony, of course, being that the drug the CIA hoped would provide the key to controlling minds and winning the Cold War wound up fueling a generational rebellion that was aimed at destroying everything the CIA stands for.
Even though John Marks said the censored CIA documents looked like Swiss cheese, there were just enough details in the 1,600 pages for him to piece together the truth.
They had blacked names out, and sometimes you would find like there would be a letter left in because they didn't black out. So there would be an N at the end and a B in the beginning. And because in those days typewriters had even spacing, you could tell how many letters it was. So we'd be looking for a 7-letter word that starts in B and that ends in N about a scientist in Washington. And sometimes you would do this by going into the journals. Sometimes you would do it by looking in the professional directories. So you'd find a scientist with that kind of name, background, or the like.
That's incredible. Sort of a forensic crossword, and this is all before, of course, the internet.
Right. It would have been easier if there had been an internet, because you could have done different kinds of cross-checking, but we did pretty well, I felt. But the whole thing was...
The documents Marks received were mainly financial records. He did follow the money. And that's how he discovered the funding that was being sent to Dr. Cameron for Sub-Project 68.
Once I understood that he was getting CIA funding, my main source of what Cameron was doing was the journals and articles he had written himself. He would write articles about the various techniques he was using, electroshock that would go on for 60 or 70 days, that kind of stuff, massive electroshock. And it was in the journals.
Cameron's techniques may not have been completely secret, but no one was suspecting that a psychiatrist at the very top of his field was funded by the CIA to experiment on patients, not to find ways to make them better, but to learn how to brainwash them.
One of the most prominent universities had turned its psychiatric hospital to a PhD doctor, head of the Canadian Psychiatric Association, head of the American Psychiatric Association, head of the World Psychiatric Association. And this man was doing totally unethical things, which probably ranked up there with some of the Nazi atrocities. And I don't say that lightly. He really was messing with people and hurting them very seriously.
When The Search for the Manchurian Candidate was released, John Marks had another bestseller, and Cameron's former patients were particularly interested.
One sunny morning, I think it was a Sunday morning, I was sitting and reading the New York Times, and on the left-hand page there was an article that talked about this CIA project called MKULTRA, which had been a project to develop methods of mind control. And one of the places that was mentioned was the Allen Memorial Institute.
Remember Harvey Weinstein?
I usually introduce myself by saying Harvey Weinstein, the other one.
Lou Weinstein, Harvey's dad, was a patient of Dr. Ewan Cameron's at Montreal's Allen Memorial.
This was a book written by John Marks called The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. And when I saw that, all of a sudden a light went off, and I thought, my God, this is the explanation. This is really what it was all about. And, you know, I think of it, and even now I have this sort of memory of time just frozen, of just the whole world stopping. And in the article, it talked about the fact that some Washington lawyers were going to bring a case against the CIA. And I then talked to my parents and said, do you want me to explore this further? And my father would have none of it. He got extremely upset and agitated, and my mother ultimately said, no, let it go. And then my mother died suddenly of a heart attack, and I went back to my father and I told him that his whole life had been taken away from him, that he had been robbed of a fulfilling existence, that his marriage had been affected, that all his friends had disappeared, and that it was time to take control of this and to show that we could fight back.
But how do a handful of Canadians sue one of the most secretive and powerful intelligence agencies in the world?
Now, I know the CIA doesn't mind wasting anybody. But you see, when you're one of the wasted, you sort of would like people to know, and I really want to go into court and have the whole story revealed.
That's next time on Brainwashed. Brainwashed is written and produced by Lisa Ellenwood, Chris Oake, and me, Michelle Shepard. Sarah Melton is our associate producer. Sound design by Cecil Fernandez. Our digital producer is Emily Cannell. The senior producer of CBC Podcasts is Tanya Springer, and our executive producer is Arif Noorani. Special thanks to Alina Ghosh, Keith Hart with CBC Radio Archives, and the CBC Reference Library. For discussions, posts, videos, and pictures, find us on social media. Just search for CBC Podcasts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme song is Desert Novel by Key Witness. Brainwashed is produced by CBC Podcasts and the Fifth Estate. You may like is Hunting Warhead. The series follows a global team of police and journalists as they attempt to dismantle a massive network of predators on the dark web. It's raw, compelling, and surprising. Winner of the grand prize for Best Investigative Reporting at the New York Festivals, and recommended by The Guardian, Vulture, and the Globe and Mail. You can find Hunting Warhead on CBC Listen or wherever you get your podcasts.
Good evening. I'm Eric Malling. 4 years ago, there were some startling revelations about the activities of the CIA in Canada. The American Intelligence Agency had paid for a series of brainwashing experiments under a project codenamed MKUltra. 9 Canadians are now suing the U.S. government for $1 million apiece.
It's 1984, the year that is, not the dystopian state of affairs. Although the details about MKUltra do take a page right out of George Orwell's novel.
Their lives were disrupted forever as a result of the brainwashing.
This is the CBC's investigative program, The Fifth Estate.
In Winnipeg, Val Orlico spends a lot of time tending her plants. It's one of the few hobbies she has left. She used to devour books and write long letters. Now she can't concentrate on a book for more than a single page, and writing a letter is beyond her.
She's on medication.
It was just a terrible nightmare. And I just felt that I could never go back to what I'd been.
When news broke about MKUltra in the late 1970s, thanks to the dogged journalism of John Marks and other American journalists, Val Orlico and her husband David were paying close attention.
I found out as a result of a major story in the New York Times in August of 1977.
That's David Orlico.
Here is a situation in which a U.S. agency came into Canada, funded an experiment in Canada which had very serious effects, adverse effects on Canadians.
David Orlico wasn't just any Canadian. He was a member of Parliament. But his interest in this case, it wasn't political. It was personal. His wife, Velma, who friends called Val, had been a patient at Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute. A patient of Dr. Ewan Cameron's.
It was an awful feeling to realize when I found this out that the man whom I had thought cared about what happened to me didn't give a damn. I was a fly. Just a fly.
Velma was devastated when she heard about the CIA's role in Dr. Cameron's work. She was angry, too. She wanted answers. She wanted justice. Not just from the Canadian institutions involved, but the American government, too. The CIA.
When she said she wanted to sue the CIA, I said, "You're crazy. How can the hick from Winnipeg sue the CIA?"
How could the Orlicos, just a couple of self-described hicks from Winnipeg, take on one of the world's most powerful intelligence agencies? Because to go after the CIA in those days, maybe you did need to be a little crazy, or at least be a fighter, and be ready for a drawn-out and dirty war. I'm Michelle Shepard, and this is Brainwashed. Episode 4, Suing the CIA. Jim, why don't I just start by having you introduce yourself and tell me who you are?
Yeah, I'm Jim Turner. I'm a retired lawyer who represented 9 Canadians in a lawsuit against the United States government based on unwitting experimental brainwashing procedures that they were subjected.
Jim Turner was the junior attorney on the case against the CIA. He worked alongside legendary American civil rights lawyer Joseph Rao.
I worked for Joe actually the final summer that I was in law school. He wrote a piece about lawyers' ethics, and I helped him as a research assistant. The thesis was that if you're going to be practicing law, you ought to be doing something worthwhile while you're doing it, not just representing anybody that can pay for any cause. And I certainly wholeheartedly supported that. And from that time until Joe's retirement, we were essentially soulmates on the approach to legal issues. The litany of fights that Joe waged to try to make the world a better place and to battle in the public interest is truly legendary. Yeah.
Rao had represented writers during the communist witch hunts and defended those who fought for voting rights and desegregation. He was one of the foremost U.S. civil rights attorneys of his time.
And he brought that humanity to all aspects of the practice of law. But that's not to say that he was some kind of bleeding heart. Man was a fighter.
David and Velma Orlico had found their fighter.
Mr. Orlico said, "You got to help me. My wife was admitted to the Allen Memorial Institute with a bout of postpartum depression, and she's never the same afterwards.
And do you remember, Jim, meeting David and Val yourself?
Yes, David and Velma Orlico came to Washington after we were able to tell them that there was a legal way to bring suit. And we met in our offices for several hours. They're both very impressive people, clearly telling the absolute truth about horrible, horrible experiences that they have both had. So they were very sympathetic folks to deal with.
How did you go about building this case?
We start with David Orlico and Velma Orlico, but they're not by themselves. There are other people who were at the Allen Memorial Institute during the time frame when CIA funding ran to it. So with David's help, we found 8 other people and families who had been impacted by these.
Dr. Harvey Weinstein, whose father Lou had been a patient at the Allen, was one of the 8 other people.
I think it was a Sunday morning. I was sitting and reading the New York Times, and on the left-hand page, there was an article that talked about this CIA project called MKULTRA. And one of the places that was mentioned was the Allen Memorial Institute. And in the article, it talked about the fact that some Washington lawyers were going to bring a case against the CIA.
Once Harvey convinced his dad to take part in the lawsuit, he traveled to Washington to meet Joe Rao.
He was awesome, if I can use the word in its pure sense. He was a big man and very dignified, and I was cowed, frankly, when I met him. Here I was, this quote, survivor or victim, or however you want to describe that, and I needed someone to help me. And in a sense, he became almost not a pseudo-father per se, but a mentor, someone who could say, the law can be on your side, and I'm here to help you, and we're going to work on this. And so I felt as though I had a collaborator, that I was not alone, that Rao and Turner and myself were a team, and that's the way it felt for the next 8 years.
8 years.
The suit, filed 18 months ago, was delayed by a United States government motion.
Tomorrow, lawyers for the CIA will go before the judge in this case and ask for a delay pending.
The government of the United States moved to dismiss on various technical grounds. The judge waited over a year to make his decision. He made his decision.
From the date that we filed this suit in December of 1980, there has been a studied strategy, in my estimation, of delaying and stonewalling every step in the litigation so that the elderly and frail plaintiffs will just disappear.
A landmark case in which the Canadian plaintiffs charged the Central Intelligence Agency with a reckless disregard for their lives. Now, the agency has won yet another delay. The Canadian's lawyer accused the CIA of deliberately stalling.
We had some bad luck, not only in the defendant, which is the CIA, an institution that can misuse national security to hide misconduct, but we also had some bad luck in the draw of our judge. It wasn't a bad judge. He just wouldn't decide anything. And it took an inordinate amount of time to get simple motions resolved. And all this is against a backdrop of an elderly lead counsel. Joe wasn't a spring chicken at this point. He was in his 70s. And there was a part of this trying to wait out Joe's biological clock until he couldn't bring.
Essentially, what Turner and Rao needed to prove was that the CIA knew the experiments were incredibly dangerous and possibly life-threatening, and that the agency should have known that those in charge of MKUltra had a track record of reckless actions that risked lives. This went back to the death of Frank Olson, the CIA biochemist who had been slipped LSD by his colleagues and then days later either jumped or was pushed from a New York hotel window.
There was negligence throughout the operation. But to me, identifying the key actors at the CIA made the negligence just irrefutable, because it was the same two individuals who were involved in the Olson death, Sidney Gottlieb and Robert Lashbrook, who had signed off on the funding for Cameron. To put it in kind of crude terms, after they killed Olson, they were given a green light to continue on with the work and hurt more people across the country and across the border into Canada. So that was key. The second is, this is a form of malpractice, is what went on in Montreal. And you have to have what's called a standard of care legally to establish malpractice. So we did research and found that standard of care embodied in the Nuremberg Code. And the first principle, the very first principle of the Nuremberg Code is the informed consent of the experimental subject is essential. There is no record that anybody in the group of people we represented ever consented to be part of any experiment at the Allen Memorial Institute.
Dr. Harvey Weinstein soon became more than just the son of one of the 9 plaintiffs in the case. He was a psychiatrist, the same profession as Dr. Cameron, and he brought that valuable perspective. But his expertise went much further.
Harvey was in a unique position to provide truly expert assistance to us in assembling the case. In fact, Harvey was an indefatigable researcher and found at the archives of the American Psychiatric Association a speech where Cameron actually admits that they were testing brainwashing. They were playing with brainwashing techniques at the Allen Memorial Institute.
It was vital evidence, the admission that what happened to these patients at the Allen was not about treating their psychiatric ailments, but about brainwashing experiments. Meanwhile, Rao and Turner were deposing the top CIA brass. That included Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA's chemist, the one Stephen Kinzer calls the poisoner-in-chief.
We interrogated Gottlieb for 3 days, and you got to understand, Gottlieb was an assassin. One of his first jobs at the agency was to go to the Congo with anthrax to try to assassinate Patrice Lumumba. This is not the usual kind of witness that you interrogate. And he was completely unrepentant. But if you interrogate these guys carefully, you can get key points out of them. And what Gottlieb admitted was they didn't lift a finger to make sure the work they were funding was done ethically. And he also said quite openly that the Olson death was something that he regretted very much, but it just happens.
He's basically arguing that's just collateral damage for the greater good of his mission.
You can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs.
Wow. Up next was John Gittinger, the CIA's chief psychologist for clandestine services.
John Gittinger was the program officer for the Cameron work when it first began. And before we went out to depose Gittinger, the CIA had repeatedly taken the position that Cameron came to them, that he was unsolicited, that it was just out of the blue that Cameron came to the CIA front in New York and asked for funding. When we deposed Gittinger, we asked him, how did you get to be Cameron? Oh, we were interested in the work he was doing. So did Cameron come to you? Oh, no, we went to him and solicited an application. And that just exploded one of the principal defenses that the CIA had been asserting through the early years of the litigation.
During this time, Rao and Turner reached out to Canada's embassy in Washington for assistance. Surely a sovereign nation would be outraged that the CIA funded the torture of its citizens on its own soil. They assumed the Canadian government would help them build their case. But they assumed wrong.
I heard about it, I think, first from the ambassador, to whom I was very close.
Jeremy Kinsman was a young Canadian diplomat based in Washington when the lawsuit against the CIA first got underway.
I was the Minister for Political Affairs at the Canadian Embassy. And it's in that position I was in charge of all political, international relations affairs, security, intelligence, legal affairs.
Canada's ambassador to Washington was Alan Gottlieb. And I know, it's a bit confusing to introduce another Gottlieb into the story. Sidney Gottlieb was the CIA chemist who created MKUltra. There's no relation between the two.
And we were very close. And so whenever there was something delicate to do or something he wanted done by somebody who understood him and where he was coming from, I would be the one who would get it.
Ambassador Gottlieb, like David Orlico, was also from Winnipeg.
Alan was very devoted to his Winnipeg origins and always had an ear for anybody from Winnipeg, and particularly anybody, I'll say, with a grievance.
So at the embassy, Jeremy Kinsman became the point person on the MKUltra file, and eventually he went to lunch with Joe Rao.
I'm Michel, I have to confess. I'm a progressive, and we progressive have our heroes. And Joe Rao was, to me, a really effective advocate of civil liberties in the United States, taking on a lot of cases. So I paid a lot of deference to him. He had a sense of indignation about this case. He wanted me to share that indignation. But he wanted the Canadian government to share the indignation.
So he basically expected the Canadian government to stand up for its citizens in this.
You bet. And I kind of expected it too, I thought that's what we were all working for. And so we proceeded from there. And it was a great disappointment to me that not everybody felt that way.
Early on, when we were dealing with Jeremy Kinsman and the folks at the embassy here in Washington, the Canadian government was very supportive and helped us greatly to get secure information and gave us active support in trying to persuade the CIA to do right by these people. That changed overnight when evidence that the CIA was not the only funding source for Dr. Cameron came to light. It turns out that the Canadian government, too, had been giving Cameron financial support.
Over a period of 3 years, the CIA, through its front organization, sent more than $60,000 US to Dr. Cameron, which is just over $500,000 today. But a Vancouver journalist uncovered internal government documents that showed Canada had provided even more funding to Cameron than the CIA. The lead CIA lawyer told a reporter that when the case got to trial, he would, quote, wrap the Canadian government's involvement around Joe Rao's neck.
So as soon as that became public, there was like a night and day change in approach. I believe the ambassador, Alan Gottlieb, was the one that made it clear to us that the days of assistance were over. But that wasn't the worst blow. One of the time-honored ways to delay and obfuscate the facts is to appoint a commission. And the Canadian government did that.
The Canadian government was not only not interested in helping build a case against the CIA, they were worried. Worried that they could now be sued as well. So Canada's Justice Minister asked George Cooper, a Halifax lawyer and former Conservative MP, to investigate whether Canada's funding of Dr. Cameron could be considered illegal or improper. But Cooper was instructed to only interview government officials. Dr. Cameron had already died, and none of Dr. Cameron's colleagues, nor his patients or their families, were even contacted. The Cooper report was publicly released in May 1986. He found that Canada had, quote, no legal or moral responsibility for the activities of Dr. Ewan Cameron. He let the CIA off the hook too, writing that the agency was only involved in funding and not involved in instigating, directing, and controlling Cameron's work. This is Rao's reaction at the time the report was released.
No, everything that the CIA has said to me is mouthed by Cooper. This could have been written by the CIA. I'm not saying it was because I don't know, but it certainly could have been written by the CIA.
Well,
I'm shocked.
No matter who wrote it,
Ottawa had once threatened to take the U.S. to the International Court of Justice at The Hague, arguing that MKUltra's experiments conducted in Montreal violated Canada's sovereignty. Now, this Canadian report, which essentially exonerated the CIA, was being used by the agency in a final effort to defeat the case. To try and get a better understanding of what was going on behind the scenes at the time, we submitted access to information requests to the Canadian government, and we found this. A letter to the Secretary of State of External Affairs from a legal advisor. I read it to Turner. So this would be February 13th, 1986, and its subject is the Orlikow case, can the Cooper report be made public? And it says, quote, the conclusions of the Cooper report, if they become public, could indeed have a negative effect on the Canadian plaintiff's case. It is possible and indeed likely that the report may be seen in some quarters as deliberate sabotage. Joe Rao and his clients might go so far as to accuse the Canadian government of collusion with the U.S. government in this matter.
The whole Cooper saga still leaves a bad taste in my mouth because they sent guys down here and, I opened my files up to them, worked with them for a substantial amount of time. And then you get this piece of crap. It was very disappointing. One of the great disappointments during the lawsuit was the transformation of the Canadian government from a vigorous ally to a CIA toady. They carried water for the wrong side for the last few years of the case. And I'll never feel the same about the Canadian government again.
When the case against the CIA finally wrapped up, it was thanks in a large part to politics. There were no Hollywood-esque closing remarks to the court, no speeches or banging of a gavel that would reverberate beyond the courtroom walls. The case, like so many other litigations, ended in a settlement.
There had been a change in administrations, and in a final effort to try to get our clients some compensation while they were still alive, we wrote to the new CIA director, Judge Webster. And Judge Webster was one of the people in government who was willing to cut through and override the people who just wanted to cover up and hide past misconduct. Judge Webster, as CIA director, personally intervened in the case and overruled the operations people at the CIA and agreed to a settlement.
The CIA paid about $70,000 US to each claimant. Canada threw in another $20,000 each to help cover legal costs.
When you win a case like the Orlikow case, it's always bittersweet because there's always a feeling that you might have been able to get a little bit more. But you have to be realistic about these things. The problem is that our clients are victims for life. I'm not a lawyer representing them for life, so I can walk away from this and do other things, which I did. But there's still a piece of my soul that feels the hurt of Val Orlikow, Louis Weinstein, Harvey Weinstein, Mary Moreau, Jean-Charles Paget, Robert Logie, Florence Langelman, and all the other people who we weren't able to include in the lawsuit. These were horrible things that were done.
The lawsuit focused on only 9 patients, but there were more than 100 women and men subjected to Dr. Cameron's extreme experiments.
You have to remember that when you take a public interest case, you have to balance the public interest and the private interest like this. I spent my life trying to balance it.
Joe Rao.
You can't take human beings like this and say they have to continue to suffer. They've suffered a great deal. I think we got enough for the public interest. Look, they're paying almost $1 million Canadian. That is pretty close to an admission of guilt. Oh, they won't say so. The CIA will just say I'm a big nuisance. But you don't pay almost $1 million Canadian if you don't really feel that you were at fault.
I do know that the CIA has blinked, and a blink is better than nothing.
The lead plaintiff, Val Orlico.
But you see, I would have liked to have had them convicted in some way. I think that the settlement is an amount of money. I don't think it's any amount of money to the CIA. I just think they flicked a flea off the sleeve of their jacket. You know, I didn't go in this for money. I went in this because I thought it was an outrageous thing that happened, and I wanted to do something about it. And so at least we have come this far.
None of the victims' families were really ever entirely satisfied with the settlement.
And Turner called and said, well, Webster has offered something. There will be a settlement offer.
Including Dr. Harvey Weinstein.
Jim and I had sort of a dispute about this. And basically he said to me that there really was no choice, that some of the people were older. My father was older, and this was their last chance. And so I had to go along with it. I was appalled, actually, for 2 reasons. One was because the amount of the settlement was, given the fact that my father never worked again after age 48, and the fact that we'd lost everything, and the fact that I knew some of the other people who had been affected were losing their homes and had no money, it was painful for me to see what the settlement was. The second thing was, if it was settled out of court, then there was no accountability. Then there was no precedent. Then this could happen again. And that is still something that is very painful to me.
This could happen again. When the existence of MKUltra was first made public, the CIA was happy to have it dismissed as a couple mad scientists experimenting with LSD. Crazy, fearful times in America it was during that Cold War. Strange things happened. Nothing really to see here. Time to move on. But did they? It's a powerful tool to have an intelligence agency figure out how to break down a person's mind. You could call it what you wanted, justify it in complicated ways. But at its core, isn't it really just torture?
The techniques that were done at the Allen became used in torture techniques around the world. They were used in Argentina, they were used in Chile, they were used in Central America, they were used in Northern Ireland by the British against the supposed IRA terrorists. People certainly must be aware of Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib.
On the next episode of Brainwashed, how MKUltra sheds light on the CIA's black sites.
What's important to know is that torture is happening. It's happening right now as we talk, and that the techniques that are used, where many of those were developed in the 50s at the Allen Memorial Institute.
On an island with nowhere to go, playing all the Iguana rockin' hits, it's AFN Radio Gitmo.
The 5 defendants all sit on the left-hand side, and they're in these rows, respective tables with their attorneys, with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in the first row.
It's January 2020. on the U.S. Naval Station Base, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, in a makeshift courtroom where the 5 alleged conspirators of the 9/11 attacks are on trial.
And this was a particularly tense week because Mitchell was going to testify about his activity, and it was going to bring out very vividly what in fact had occurred when these defendants were in the black sites.
It's sort of interesting because Khalid Sheikh Mohammed didn't react. We all went there, held our breath, wanting to see what would happen.
Dr. Mitchell seemed to focus on expressions on the defendants' faces and whether someone was looking at him funny. You know, it was clear that they had a very odd connection.
This was the first time that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was sitting there in the company of the man who waterboarded him. And it was Dr. Mitchell, the interrogator, who was forced to answer the questions. It wasn't violent, it wasn't physical, it wasn't threatening, but as much as Mitchell tried to be in control, it was the defense lawyers who asked the questions and he had to answer them. And it was a real kind of surreal tables turn moment.
James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen are the 2 psychologists who were paid more than $80 million by the CIA to come up with an interrogation program for high-profile war on terror captives. This was the first time Mitchell and Jessen were forced to testify about the methods they devised, the enhanced interrogation techniques, the EITs, waterboarding, keeping people awake for days on end, shackling, confinement boxes, extreme temperatures, sounds, and pain. They were experiments, really, on how to make people do what you want them to do, make them talk. You could almost think of it as a form of mind control, but most just call it for what it is: torture. I'm Michelle Shepard, and this is Brainwashed. Episode 5, We Tortured Some Folks.
Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday. I thought I'd take some questions, but first, let me say a few words about the economy. This morning we learned that...
That's Obama, former U.S. President Barack Obama in 2014, standing before the White House press corps.
So with that, let me take a couple of questions.
Just days after President Obama came to power, he quickly dismantled some of the post-9/11 measures brought in by his predecessor, George W. Bush. He shut down the network of secret CIA prisons known as black sites and abolished the use of enhanced interrogation techniques, the EIT program that Jessen and Mitchell developed. But by 2014, his presidential honeymoon was over. Guantanamo was still open, despite his pledge to shut it down, and he was facing questions about the Senate Intelligence Committee report on the CIA's actions, an investigation into exactly what happened to those CIA captives.
The RDI report has been transmitted, the declassified version that will be released at the pleasure of the Senate committee.
The RDI report, the CIA's rendition, detention, and interrogation program.
Even before I came into office, I was very clear that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, we did some things that were wrong. We did a whole lot of things that were right, but we tortured some folks.
We tortured some folks.
It's important for us not to feel too sanctimonious in retrospect about the tough job that those folks had. But having said all that, we did some things that were wrong. And we have to, as a country, take responsibility for that so that hopefully we don't do it again in the future.
Obama's narrative was widely accepted. This was an aberration, something so extreme due to extreme times. That's how these incredibly violent new interrogation methods, the EITs, were invented. When we started this podcast, I knew about post 9/11 policies. I'd reported on them for years, been to Guantanamo a couple dozen times, and while I knew the vague outlines of MKUltra and the CIA's involvement in foreign conflicts, I had no idea of the direct correlation to modern-day torture. That what took place at the black sites in Guantanamo after the September 11th, 2001 attacks, it could be traced back more than half a century earlier, to the start of the Cold War, to MKUltra, and to the Allen in Montreal. This wasn't new.
My name is James Connell, and I am learned counsel for the defense team of Ammar al-Baluchi as part of the Military Commissions Defense Organization, working in the United States Military Commissions in Guantanamo Bay.
He's an experienced death penalty lawyer, which is required in capital cases.
And I have a little disclaimer that I have to give at the beginning, and I know that it never gets picked up verbatim, but that's fine. But the disclaimer is that although I am paid by the United States Department of Defense, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Department of Defense, and that nothing I'm about to say in this interview is based on classified information.
James Connell has top secret security clearance, which means he knows more than he can say. As a Guantanamo defense attorney, he's fighting to keep his client from being sentenced to death. Not many people would have sympathy for his client or for the 4 other men accused of orchestrating the 9/11 attacks. But this trial is actually less about them. Because for Connell to most effectively defend al-Baluchi, he actually has to prosecute the actions of the state. In other words, prove that the CIA tortured his client while in custody. And to prove that, he's had to go back in time.
Before I started the case, I had no idea of how much the United States had grappled with the issue of how to make people do what someone wanted them to do. The amount of money and effort that went into what the CIA called brainwashing is astonishing. That story really begins with the Korean War, because in the Korean War, the North Koreans and Chinese backers used techniques, not all that sophisticated, to get U.S. service members to say a lot of things that they wanted them to say. And that was around the same time that Director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, in 1953, popularized the word brainwashing in the United States. He gave a speech at Princeton in which he described a process by which the Chinese could brainwash people. And he even describes
They took our boys and brainwashed them and had them filmed there so that they would give out the most extraordinary lies. I am no doubt myself. I mean, we've never had any guinea pigs. We can't try this thing out. We've just deductive reasoning. They have had in their slave camps, in their prison camps, they have had an indefinite number of people whom they can try out all these techniques. And they are so many years ahead of us and all that, I mean, there's no comparison.
As the CIA's director was publicly discussing communist brainwashing, lamenting the fact that the U.S. didn't have human guinea pigs, the CIA was secretly launching MKUltra, a program that essentially would give them human guinea pigs, prisoners, clients of sex workers, even their own agency staff, and of course, the psychiatric patients at the Allen. The CIA never did learn how to brainwash people. And here's the thing, neither did the communist governments. When scientists actually studied the American POWs returning from the Korean War, they discovered a far more simple explanation for all the strange behavior. The men had been tortured. So, the U.S. Air Force created a program to better prepare their forces should they become prisoners of war. It was called SEER.
That story really begins with the creation of the SEER program.
That stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape.
The program of how to resist interrogation.
The first SEER students were American pilots. After the Vietnam War, soldiers and sailors also underwent the training. Today, every branch of the military has its own program, and most of the curriculum remains classified. The idea behind SEER is that you expose your troops to horrible treatment in a controlled environment so that if they are captured and tortured, they'll be better equipped to endure the abuse. But while the military was developing their internal SEER program to build defenses against interrogations and torture, the CIA was creating its own manual for how to conduct interrogations using torture. Remember Sidney Gottlieb, the guy who ran MKUltra?
Gottlieb's research produced some written observations, some reports that were kept within the CIA about how do you destroy a person? How do you interrogate a person? How can you make a prisoner dependent on the interrogator?
This is Stephen Kinzer, who wrote the book on Gottlieb, calling him the poisoner in chief.
He had so much experience with the hundreds of expendables that he experimented to death. So he wrote up some guidelines for how to do this.
These secret CIA guidelines would evolve into other manuals that would be circulated within the agency and beyond. These manuals were used throughout Latin America in the 1970s and 80s.
When they arrested me and they took me to the Departamento de Información store, I was there tortured basically during the first 3 days. They will use traditional electroshock. They will put it in different parts of my body.
Maria says her torturers were university educated, and their methods more sophisticated. They not only used electrical shocks, but also simulated the voices of her family on tape.
They working with electricity, and they play with my body and my mind.
They were doctors, some of them psychiatrists, who not only used electricity, but also tried to brainwash her. Their knowledge of the body and the mind made them both effective and cruel torturers. Both Salvadorans came across men who told them they didn't like.
The CIA's involvement in this torture was finally revealed by a Baltimore Sun investigation. The newspaper found that the CIA had been training Honduran military forces accused of kidnapping, torture, and murder. For 3 years, the Baltimore Sun fought to have the CIA's training manuals declassified under a Freedom of Information request. Only after the paper threatened to sue the agency did the CIA turn over the redacted documents in 1997. 2 manuals were released. A 1983 handbook given the beautifully bureaucratic title of the Human Resource Exploitation Training Manual, and another, written in the early 1960s, just as MKUltra was winding down.
The so-called Kubark Assassination Manual, Kubark being the CIA's cryptonym for itself.
The official name for the manual was Kubark Counterintelligence Interrogation. Over 128 pages, the manual details suggested interrogation methods. The principal techniques include deprivation of sensory stimuli, threats and fear, pain, hypnosis, and narcosis. It includes references to, quote, a number of experiments at McGill University, with long sections devoted to sensory deprivation. The core of the manual directly relies on Dr. Ewan Cameron's work at McGill and his theory that to make a mind more malleable, you had to break it down to an infantile state. The prisoners must essentially be depatterned so they would look to their interrogators as a father figure.
Those torture techniques that we taught to secret police forces in Latin America had their roots back in the Gottlieb era.
Now, the pattern was clear. The MKUltra experiments evolved into interrogation techniques in Kubark, which were then updated and used in the Human Resource Exploitation Manual. Call it brainwashing or mind control if you want, but achieving psychological dependence, essentially through torture, is the consistent directive.
And finally, after 9/11, when the United States set up Guantanamo and its other network of secret prisons around the world, what kinds of techniques could be used? What should CIA officers do in those prisons? They, again, reached back to Gottlieb's research and the manuals and the techniques that have been used at Guantanamo and at those secret torture bases that the U.S. established around the world are also drawn directly from Gottlieb's research. So he's the beginning of all the CIA's research in how to control prisoners, how to destroy their minds, and how to make people you're interrogating feel they have no connection with the outside world, and therefore they have to do what you tell them.
Okay, we can do this.
It feels weird to get you to formally introduce yourself, but go for it.
Well, my name is Carol Rosenberg.
Carol Rosenberg is a good friend of mine.
I'm a reporter with the New York Times, and that's been true for a year now. And before that, I was, for many years, a reporter with the Miami Herald, starting in 1990. And I cover Guantanamo Bay, the place, the policy, the prison, and stuff related to detainees, and particularly the trials these days that are going on down there.
I met Carol in Guantanamo, and for years we shared a tent with 3 other female journalists on a strip of asphalt in an area the U.S. military called Camp Justice. I can't praise Carol's dogged determination enough. In the press corps, we call her the Dean, and no one knows more about Guantanamo than Carol.
Where do you want to begin? It really begins in 1990 in Baghdad, but I don't know if that you want to start there.
I do want to start there. Go back there, yeah. Carol has had a long and illustrious career as a journalist.
So that starts in the Middle East when I was a Middle East correspondent. And in the early 90s, the U.S. State Department decided to cut off relations with Sudan. And I had a tip that this was coming. They were going to put them on the sponsors of terror list. And I went over to write about this place where kind of all of the radical leaders and movements had gathered. Hezbollah was there, Hamas was there. I think Carlos the Jackal was there in Khartoum. And there was a guy named Osama bin Laden. And I actually paid no attention to him because I thought he was nobody. And when September 11th happened, I was home on Miami Beach in my house. You want this whole story, Michelle?
I do. Keep going.
Okay. So I jumped in my car and drove to the Herald. And one of our 2 managing editors was standing there. And because I was supposed to be this expert on terrorism, she said, well, who did this? And I said, I guess if you believe what we've been hearing, Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda. The planes resumed about 5 days later, and they sent me off to the Middle East. And then we started hearing that they might want to put some kind of prison for some kind of prisoners related to the war in Afghanistan in Guantanamo.
By now it's the end of December 2001, and then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld announced that captives would be going to Guantanamo.
I would characterize Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, as the least worst place we could have selected.
And soon after, Carol was on a U.S. military plane to Cuba.
Which was January 8th. They brought in 19 reporters and there was no flight off. So we ended up spending 1 or 2 nights. Then we were supposed to leave, and suddenly the CNN reporter got word that prisoners were on their way to Guantanamo. And this was as much a surprise to people at Guantanamo, I think, as it was to us. And the military tried to rush us off the base. I learned a lot about how to dig in and stay from the CNN reporter, who at one point hid in the bathroom, which I would not have done, but about how just because they tell you have to go, you try to negotiate to stay.
The journalists weren't leaving, not when a plane load of captives was on the way.
American gunboats were off the coast. Marines were arrayed around the airstrip, and the cargo plane from the American Air Force came in and landed at Gitmo, and one by one they pulled off 20 men in orange jumpsuits with goggles on their face and blue surgical masks on their mouths and caps on their head, and mittens taped to their hands, which were shackled together, and shuffled them off that plane in these tight little leg shackles. They were coming from ice-cold Afghanistan. It was winter there. They'd been in an ice-cold cargo plane. They hit the heat in Guantanamo, and they collapsed one by one on their knees to the ground as they were being held by the Marines. They got put on a bus, shackled to the floor of a white school bus, were driven onto a ferry, went across the bay, drove down Sherman Avenue, past the movie theater, the neighborhoods, the McDonald's, to the other end of Guantanamo Bay, and were put into cages that looked like kennels in what was called Camp X-Ray. And that day, January 11th, 2002, the Guantanamo Detention Center was born.
That was what the public was allowed to see that day. Or rather, what the journalists were allowed to record for the public through their words. No photos or videos were allowed. And they certainly couldn't witness what went on with the prisoners once they were behind closed doors in Guantanamo, let alone what was happening elsewhere.
They told us we were getting the worst of the worst, and that became sort of the slogan and the idea that the eventual 779 people who passed through Guantanamo were the worst of the worst. But the truth of the matter is for the first 5 years of Guantanamo, from 2002 until September 2006, they weren't the worst of the worst. The U.S. military and the U.S. government and the U.S. intelligence agencies, the FBI and the CIA, created a secret program. The men who they thought were the high-value captives, that's what they called them, were taken to a secret set of prisons run by the CIA around the world.
So while the reporters were trying to figure out the quagmire that was Guantanamo, there were prisoners no one even knew about. These so-called high-value detainees who had disappeared into the black sites.
What went on in the black sites of the CIA was that experiment on steroids, because nobody knew about it. The U.S. didn't acknowledge it.
To understand how this happened and what went on in these CIA black sites, we have to go back to
test case number one in this.
Test case number one. This is when the CIA consulted with psychologists James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, and the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques were developed. The CIA wanted answers, fast, from a detainee known as Abu Zubaydah, and they figured that these two psychologists could help. Abu Zubaydah was suspected of belonging to al-Qaeda and having information about impending attacks. He was picked up in Pakistan in 2002, but taken to a CIA secret prison.
By the time Mitchell and Jessen get called by the CIA, they have this man named Abu Zubaydah in Thailand, and the FBI has been interrogating him and trying to use what they say was rapport building coupled with some certainly isolation techniques and other things. And the CIA was impatient and didn't think that the FBI was working, and they decided to, I think the quote is, take the gloves off and design a different program that would dismantle these people's self-esteem in a way and get them to spill everything they knew. And so these two men get hired, first as consultants, charged with coming up with these interrogation techniques. Mitchell says they were in Washington, I believe, and they sat in a room and they typed up a list of them. And they included things like short shackling, sleep deprivation, confining people to a cramped box, waterboarding, dietary manipulation. They came up with a list of these things.
The RDI report, the one Obama was talking about at the press conference, the one that details what happened to Abu Zubaydah and 118 other detainees in CIA custody, it's more than 6,700 pages long, and only 549 of those pages are public in an executive summary, and even those ones are censored. Mitchell and Jessen are mentioned in the report under pseudonyms, Quote, neither psychologist had experience as an interrogator, nor did either have specialized knowledge of Al-Qaeda, a background in terrorism, or any relevant regional, cultural, or linguistic expertise. The only experience they could draw upon was from their involvement with the Air Force SEER program and the CIA's past experiments. But as noted in the Senate's report, even the CIA knew coercive interrogations didn't work. MKUltra was a failure. Kubark and the Human Resource Exploitation Manual just left a litany of abused and broken prisoners. The CIA's Inspector General even once recommended that an unidentified CIA agent who was involved in interrogations in Latin America in the 1980s be admonished for his, quote, interrogation techniques. After the September 11, 2001 attacks, that same agent was put in charge of interrogations for post-9/11 captives.
First, I think it's important that Mitchell and Jessen really were not the wizards that designed and imagined the program. I do think that they were used by the authorities above them in the agency and probably in the White House to come up with something like this.
This is retired Army General Stephen Xenakis. He's a psychiatrist who specializes in PTSD and has worked extensively both with soldiers and veterans and the captives at Guantanamo. I've known him for years.
But they came up with these ideas. I think that essentially what they based their understanding was bad science, completely not validated in any way. There's no reason to think that it would have any positive effect and to be useful.
When you say bad science, what do you mean? What was it drawn on? What other experiments do you think that they might have borrowed from?
Well, there actually have been never any studies to show that good intelligence was retrieved from using these kinds of tactics or techniques. And I, in fact, in the 70s, interviewed a number of POWs coming out of Vietnam that they didn't produce good information when they were under high duress, when they were tortured. They just said what they needed to say to stop it.
Stephen Xenakis was among the early whistleblowers questioning the abusive interrogations, both in his capacity as a retired general and a doctor. In 2005, he wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post and immediately felt the backlash.
I felt shunned, and I called a number of my colleagues, 2 and 3 stars. And these were former surgeons general of the Army and of the other services. And they told me very pointedly, they said, Steve, I think you're wrong. We don't get involved. We don't make those decisions. And if our other senior people tell us that that's what's their policies and procedures, we're going to support and follow it. My response was, we have our own ethics codes. I mean, we're expected to be independent professionals. People look to us, particularly as clinicians, when we wear the white coats, to abide by those codes.
So there's basically no science backing the effectiveness of these new techniques, which doctors and psychologists were heavily involved in, and yet precious few in the medical community objected. Why?
Well, I think fear is at the core. I felt that from the beginning. And I remember telling my family members that we don't want to get into a climate like we had in the 50s. I was in grade school and in junior high school in the 50s. I remember all of that activity, and there was a communist behind every bush, and the bomb might come off and we had to dive under our desks, and people were building shelters. What happens is in these circumstances, and I really feel it strongly now, is that fear is exploited. And particularly in this situation where we had not adequately prepared for this kind of terrorist threat. We were still thinking along the kinds of engagements that had a Cold War element to them. I felt that the responsibility of our political leadership was to calm people, not to leverage it.
James Connell, the Guantanamo defense attorney, takes it a step further.
Fear drives hate. And one of the things that we saw in the policy process leading up to the decision to use torture was how much people were blinded by fear and hate. In that situation, asking the question of, hey, is there any empirical support for this? Or, hey, is this what the SEER techniques were designed for? Or, hey, didn't we try this once before and it was a failure? Those kinds of reasonable questions come to be perceived as weakness. I think that nobody wanted to ask the question of, is it actually going to work to torture people in the sense of generating good information? Because they didn't want to be seen as weak.
And like Dr. Xenakis, he believes that these policies were not just driven by Mitchell and Jessen, or even a small political cabal.
Torture is a bureaucracy. It takes not just, a good-looking actor with a gun and a man tied to a chair. I mean, somebody has to cook the food, somebody has to take out the trash, somebody has to check the prisoner to see if he has a temperature, somebody has to say, yes, he's not nearly dead yet, you can keep abusing him. In the black sites, there were both doctors and other kinds of healthcare professionals. One of the points that those who have testified publicly about the program have stressed is the involvement of physicians. The role of physicians varied. There was a role for physicians in actual abusive interrogations, where, as in other countries, a physician looked at the person and said, stop or keep going. There was another role, which was more ordinary healthcare. Once a government adopts the reasoning of there are no limits, then really there are no limits. The professions get swept into the bureaucracy of torture just as much as trades do.
There's something about the involvement of doctors and psychologists, those in the medical profession who we rely on to keep us well, the whole Hippocratic oath of do no harm. It just seems especially odious when the military and medicine collide. The Nazi doctors and the need for the Nuremberg Code, then Dr. Cameron's experiments on unwitting patients, and no one in the medical profession questioned him at the time. And that led to other eras of torture, under the Kubark Manual or the 1980s in Latin America, to what followed 9/11. And those who objected, like Dr. Xenakis, were shunned. Few would decry the fact that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who does not dispute being an al-Qaeda leader, was tortured. But so were many others. And how do you justify sanctioned torture that took place in Gitmo and the black sites in a court of law? James Mitchell was defiant, combative at times when he testified in Guantanamo. And Jessen?
The thing I will never forget, the last day they got Bruce Jessen on the stand. Jessen comes in and sits down and he's like, Mr. Rogers. Does that work?
Yeah, it definitely brings up a picture.
Okay. So, this man comes in, he comes off as very pleasant and genial, and he's like Mr. Rogers. And he's answering the questions, and Mitchell is defensive for 9 days, and angry and hostile. And then in comes Jessen, who's very mild-mannered and a completely different behavior, and he's being questioned, and there's a pause. And he looks over across this huge courtroom to the defendants who are 30, 40, 50 feet away from him, depending on where they are in relationship to the witness stand. And he just remarks, they've all grown up. They've just grown up. May I know who is who? I remember the air leaving my chest. I was suffocating because it was such a strange moment. He somehow was portraying that these men, that they were children. They were his charges. They were his children. And now they're all grown up and dressed like adults. And to me, that is the moment that I will never forget.
The 9/11 trial has been called the trial of the century, but it's looking more like it'll take a century to try. It has been nearly 2 decades since the attack, 7 years since the men were arraigned. There is no end in sight. The full Senate RDI report remains classified. No one has been charged or successfully sued over abuses that occurred during interrogations. In fact, some have been promoted. Gina Haspel was a senior officer overseeing the CIA's enhanced interrogation program. She came to the secret black site in Thailand just after test case number 1, Abu Zubaydah, was tortured until he nearly died. She later helped destroy the almost 100 videotapes of his abuse. Abu Zubaydah never provided any actionable intelligence as a result of his torture. He is now indefinitely detained in Guantanamo. And Gina Haspel? In 2018, U.S. President Donald Trump appointed her as the CIA's new leader. Without accountability, history does tend to repeat itself. And sometimes justice, if it comes at all, takes decades. Next time on Brainwashed.
We will continue to fight until we are heard. We will keep fighting because we know that no judge could look at our case and say, sorry, too late, because the damage is still so fresh today.
Brainwashed is written and produced by Lisa Ellenwood, Chris Oak, and me, Michelle Shepard. Sarah Melton is our associate producer. Sound design by Cecil Fernandez. Our digital producer is Emily Cannell, and our executive producer is Arif Noorani. Special thanks to Alina Ghosh, Tanya Springer, Tina Verma, Keith Hart with CBC Radio Archives, and the CBC Reference Library. And thanks to the Council of Foreign Relations for the audio of Alan Dulles. For discussions, posts, videos, and pictures, find us on social media. Just search for CBC Podcasts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.